Welcome, everyone, and you are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's pod, we are joined by Renny Vandewege, VP of Weather Operations at DTN. Renny holds a Master's of Science in Broadcast Meteorology from Mississippi State and was a weatherman for some time. How cool is that? I think it's a first and probably maybe even the only here on the pod. As a data analytics and technology company, DTN delivers operational intelligence to organizations with complex supply chains around the world. DTN also has several partnerships in the maritime space that are of note. I'm sure we'll get into that later. Renny, welcome to the pod.
Chris, thank you so much for having me on today. And I kind of hope I'm the only broadcast meteorologist you had on the pod. It's certainly a unique way to get here.
Absolutely. And I think that leads in, typically I ask my guests, tell us a little bit about your background. We talked about that, but I'm sure there's more to it.
Yeah, I was a weather nut as a kid. I grew up in Nebraska and knew I wanted to get into something to do with weather growing up. I kind of had a fear of storms, and that led me into broadcast meteorology. So I started my career as a TV meteorologist. My first day on television was Hurricane Dennis on the Gulf Coast. 1 month after that was a small little storm called Hurricane Katrina. And I quickly learned that weather was not very fun at that point. It kind of became one of those things where it caused a lot of strife and unfortunately death and destruction. And I grew up really fast in the weather world thinking I'm going to change, turn in the suit and tie and makeup and bright lights and start to figure out a way where weather impacts people and try and make a difference there. And so for the past 15 years or so, I've been in the weather industry, helping businesses and people make decisions with weather. And that led me to DTN about 3 years ago through acquisition. Previous to that, worked for a company called WDT, Weather Decision Technologies. And so 8 years total, I've been in the private weather space where we take weather information and ultimately help businesses make decisions where weather is a risk factor or a deciding factor in outcomes for all kinds of businesses.
Maybe not so recently, or recently you guys have pivoted more into the supply chain and maritime space, because I imagine you would start in a lot of the farmers, especially for given where you are, they always want to know, the forecast for crops or for bad weather, obviously out there. But explain a little bit about a pivot into supply chain and maritime, because, it is such an integral part of what is done.
Absolutely. Weather just causes disruption in all shapes and forms, whether it's trucking companies or manufacturing, but especially shipping. When we're talking about routing vessels and trying to do it efficiently, reduce carbon emissions, our work in the maritime space as multiple fold, really, because number one, we're helping out in the digitization paradigm that we're in today, where, we don't have to print out a forecast once a day on a chart. And then you put the seafarer out at sea and they just go with it, right? We're in an era where we can supply data at a pretty rapid pace, and weather is one of the most critical factors to a ship route. Secondly, it's a big factor on fuel efficiency. So we kind of look at the work that we do in the shipping space as, in my simple mind, I think there's three routes generally. One route is the fastest. Let's just go full bore straight point A to point B and get there. That's not always the most fuel efficient way to do it if you're running the engine at peak intensity. The second one's the safest route. If we know there's disruption potentially at sea due to a storm or high waves, whatever that might be, we can route around that safely, but that creates a lot more distance and therefore you're still burning fuel just at a slower clip. The third route, and where we focus, is on optimization. So we're looking at all factors of weather and sea and essentially trying to find both the fastest way to get there in the most efficient manner and doing it safely. And so it's a very natural space for us to be in when we have good control and understanding of both weather conditions and ocean conditions, to take that information and provide valuable insights to dispatchers and captains that are at sea trying to get there safely on time. And that's true in all shipping and supply chain spaces that we work in. So we do a lot with the trucking industry as well. We also work a lot in aviation. And really, whether it's land, sea, or air, those same factors come into play, albeit a little bit differently. There's certainly nuances to each of those. But at the end of the day, that's the core of the way that we look is we know we have an incredible amount of weather data. How do we leverage that to help the businesses that we serve make really smart, critical decisions that either help the bottom line financially or focused on safety of crew, even brand reputation. It's never a good look for a company to find themselves in peril in some form that could have been avoidable. So here in the last 10 years or so, as things become more digital, DTN has been really sitting in a nice position to be able to support these industries with the data and technology we provide.
When you go to somebody and you talk about digital in the weather space, you probably get a lot of, ex-sea captains, and they know it and they could have a feel for it, and they're not necessarily wrong. But I think what you're saying is you can offer them a way to see a more optimal path, right? Because sometimes the fastest and the greenest, or the fastest and the safest, isn't always the greenest or the best. Talk a little bit about how you can sit down and use, your tools or any tools and kind of shift some thinking a little bit, because I'm sure that they're, when you all come into their offices, talk to me a little bit also about their reaction, because I'm sure, even though there's becoming more and more of an acceptance to digital platforms in general, not just in optimization, but across the board, there is still a little resistance. Talk to me a little bit about, finding that resistance and how you kind of help people overcome that a little bit.
Well, we have experience with this, and I'll give you the parallel. You made reference to it earlier, is agriculture. A ship captain and a farmer have a lot in common, even though they may be thousands of miles apart from each other. So I grew up as I mentioned, in Lincoln, Nebraska. Vandewege family has been farming since our roots in the Netherlands, and we did so here in Nebraska. And even my father, it took a while for him to believe what I was telling him with regards to weather, because he grew up in an environment where you looked at the clouds, you looked at the sun. You learn by being in the environment. I see those clouds typically predate rain by a day, or the wind just shifted, the snow is about to begin, or what, some of those kind of old methodologies of looking at weather and making some assessment on it. And you know what, that did well for a really long time. And same with captain seafarers, where, hey, I've been at sea for 30 years. I know the sea. And trust me, I have all the respect in the world for that level historical knowledge. Like, it's really cool. I have a lot of respect for just being out there kind of on your own and making decisions and knowing what you know through experience. I think that's a really critical factor. However, we live in a world today where we are sensing information at an incredible clip. DTN processes petabytes of data a day in Amazon cloud, ranging from ocean data, market information, weather information. We are measuring through satellites, radar as you get close to shore, sensors that are on ships or on land. We're measuring so much data now that we have a really good capture of weather information that then feeds our information database to make really good forecasts going in the future. And they're becoming really quality. Every year it gets better. From that level of information, what I would challenge to whether it's shipping or agriculture, anybody making a digital transformation, is let us get through some of those steps that you make that take time, and we can value your time by reducing the amount of time you need to worry about some of the stuff that you spend a lot of time on, and you can focus on making higher value decisions for whatever the operation is that you're working on. The other cool thing is that we aren't just measuring weather or ocean conditions just for the sake of measuring that. We really look at our business as then taking the step beyond that to create operational intelligence. So whether that's creating digital twins of vessels so we can predict the outcome of weather or ocean currents and forecast on that vessel, we can measure down to the knot, the optimized speed to take, and those tangible insights then can be measured financially, so that when you get to your destination, you can look back and say, we saved thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars on fuel. We reduced our carbon footprint and made an impact on the environment by a pretty significant amount. And so if that's a pretty good thing to put on your resume or tell your boss, when you can come back and say, yes, I am smart and I navigated this vessel and got there at the right time, but look at the savings I made you. And so our job isn't to replace anybody that does this work or their knowledge, because that comes in very handy. It is to make it even better. That becomes a pride point once people can buy into the fact that we can help them and make them even better at what they do. We did a survey of a bunch of shipping companies, over 150 in the last year, talked about the fuel savings and the carbon emission play, because I think we had this mindset that as a company that much of the digital transformation and the benefits on the environment and fuel savings were regulatory, and because there are regulations that are helping push cleaner energy and updating vessels to today's sort of standards. Turns out that really half of the respondents were saying they just believed that was important and they weren't making the change just for regulation region, but the industry is starting to make a mind shift and say, this is an important thing that we do. We need to be cleaner in how we do it. We need to protect the environment. It's the only environment we have. And so we're getting a warmer reception today than maybe even just a few years ago, because I think the light is really clicking on for everybody that this is important info and it makes financial impact. You and I have both been to a fuel pump in the last few weeks, and by God, it hasn't been pretty. So
it hasn't.
So if you can reduce your fuel burn by 5%, and we believe we can do that with our routing algorithms, that adds up to a significant amount per company, per vessel, per industry that we think we can make a huge impact. And so talking to people that have 30, 40, 50 years of experience working their land or their vessel, we have deep amount of respect for that expertise. We also believe we can create additive value on top of that to really make an impact.
Yeah. And I think that that's very interesting, because it goes back, I was taking some notes here as you were talking, because you hit upon a few points. Firstly, about going to, having farmers and sailors. And I actually sailed, many, many years ago. And off the top of my head, I was thinking about this, 3 or 4 sailors that I knew had farms. So, and I think a lot of it had, now I don't think they were working farms like or maybe they were. I don't know how big of a working farm. I know one guy had a pretty big working farm. His wife, just when he was away, she just took over. A lot of it has to do with the same sort of independence. I think it's the same mindset. It's independent. It's also an appreciation of nature, and then appreciation of wide open spaces. I mean, because, I've never been to a farm in Nebraska, but I'm sure it has a lot of parallels to standing on a bridge wing of a ship transiting the Atlantic Ocean. To me, it just has to be the same thing. One's moving, one isn't. One has soy or corn or wheat, and the other has ocean, but I would tend to think it's the same, which is pretty interesting. So it does come across the same mindset. The other part, what I find interesting is, and I think just in technology in general, and we had an interview a couple of cycles back with a fella at Sea Machine Robotics, and it's a company that's doing vessel automation, right? So autonomous ships, and the big fear is what you've been pointing to, people getting put out of work, right? So I'm going to be out of a job because they're going to do routing for me, or they're going to navigate the ship. But what he got to the point, and I think it's a similar one that you had, which is, no, we want to eliminate some of the time, because your time is so valued. You have such a big level of expertise for higher order issues, whether you're a farmer and it's, now I have this information, I know I need to plant crop A versus crop B because I think it's going to be more conducive. Or if you're a mariner and you're saying, how can I better stow this ship? There's a lot of parallels. So I think that that's really important part of what technology is doing today.
We see this in our own business too. There's, automation, it has at times a dark cloud over it. There's a perception that it will eliminate the jobs, and yet we're having a hard time hiring people right now. So it hasn't eliminated all the jobs. It's changed our jobs. We see this in our world. Weather forecasting, even as recent as 5 or 10 years ago, was a very manual process where, humans with meteorology degrees would sit down and look at charts and draw fronts and come up with that forecast. Well, that's hard to scale because my capacity to create a forecast is limited in geography, but computers have created an ability for us to create a really solid, improving forecast that updates rapidly, globally, high resolution. Cool. So what do we do with our meteorologists now? We have them communicate, and they provide context, and they look for impact of that forecast on the various customers we serve. And so the job role changed. Many of those that you surveyed, did that worry you? They would say yes and say, are you mad now a few years later? And say, no, my job is way more fun today. I'm focusing on higher value things rather than maybe just staring at a chart or whatever and spending that time. So to us, it's a value equation across everything that we do. But I would, again, we did this with farmers. And by the way, the farming digital transformation is not done yet either. Also kind of going through, I see really incredible parallels to shipping in that regard, but making the farm more efficient and more profitable. Now it's not sunrise to sundown. Maybe you can save a few hours of time for your, working on the market side or trying to figure out where you're going to sell your products. It makes a massive difference. And so I think in shipping, we're seeing that. You've alluded to this where there are companies that we find success when we work with companies that all the way up to the C-suite of the organization, they are ready to make the digital transformation. Once they understand the benefits towards the top of the company, that tends to permeate a bit better throughout the organization. They invest in the right tools. They invest in some new people in terms of maybe software engineering, those that can build applications, take this data and make it useful, and respect the knowledge base of those that have worked in the industry for a long time.
It comes down to, having a level of expertise that you can't replace, right? With MI, AI, whatever, but you just augment it. So like you said, the farmer can go look at what markets he or she wants to sell onto. The mariner or the operations person can worry about more, let's say, customer focused issues, items, let's say, got put aside because they were working on lower operational issues that can now be automated to an extent, but you still need that eyeball to make sure, does it pass, let's say, a sniff test? And then after a while, there becomes a level of comfort there that where they can really focus on the bigger things. A big pipeline for sailors in this part of the world, and many are the maritime schools, as they start to populate ships and community. What would you tell the sailors of tomorrow in terms of weather and technology? What's kind of the message for the schools, or let's say even not necessarily the maritime academies, but then the trade schools that teach people? What would you tell about, what's happening in weather today? Because they may look at it and go, weather, I could look outside and it's raining. What would you tell let's say, the folks coming into the industry?
I spent part of my career actually teaching broadcast meteorology for a period of time. And my entire job cycle was essentially updating the curriculum to a more digital environment. When I got there, we were using old tape decks. In fact, I remember putting multiple VHS tapes in these decks and recording, and we moved to a digital environment. What happened is we got more eyeballs on our program nationally than we did previously because people could see us on the internet. So, I put a huge focus on that digital transformation at the school level. What I saw with number one, they got exposure in the industry, but number two, they were champions for digital change, new technological change at their stations. And as a result, they ended up rising through the ranks pretty quickly. And so as you sort of think about the young students or proteges, or you think about the programs themselves, what I would encourage is to get some of these new tools and get them in as part of the curriculum today. Get the hands on those, make it part of the workflow already coming out of school. And it's possible, I've seen this happen. It's possible that the student goes to work and maybe they need to take a step backwards a little bit, and they're not quite ready for that, but they can become a champion of change for digitization because that's how they grew up learning. Any program where we're going through this technological change, it's really important to make practical experience. In fact, the course I taught, Chris, was called Practicum. It was literally practical experience for the job that you're doing in the future. And in these programs, if you can create as part of that training, the use of that technology, and when you're thinking of weather specifically, it's not just looking at a weather forecast. Now, I want to reiterate something I said before, which is we don't view ourselves as weather forecasters or ocean forecasters. That's an input to what we really do for customers, which is drive outcome-based decisioning, recommendations, alerts. Those are the really impactful data points that people can use in planning or en route. And if you can incorporate some of that into the curriculum and get the students learning as early as possible, I think that's how we'll see rapid change throughout the industry as the young next crop gets out there and starts working full time. They'll be used to it, and that'll be part of their normal workflow.
Industry involvement at the school level. And whether it's, I mean, it started years ago with having a radar simulator. I remember when I went to school a million years ago, that's what that was. And it became bridge simulators and engine simulators. And now, yeah, you are hearing and seeing a lot of organizations taking the next step of, hey, we have a fairly major software that we could put in your school, make it a part of your curriculum and make it efficient. And even if you go to a company, let's say it doesn't use your firm's tools, they have a better understanding. And like you said, they could become an advocate. And who knows, for the companies that put it in the school, it's the students may turn around and say, I used this other stuff that was a little better in college, and get that discussion going. And it becomes a little bit of a race there, which I think benefits everybody. It makes the workforce more flexible, more agile. And it also puts the companies, whatever company it is, in a better place, kind of not reputation wise, but certainly more ingrained in the industry. And then you could also see what's going on in the industry from a more of a holistic view of the industry that you can then hopefully, move on and make life a little bit better for sure.
I'll tell you this story, and it doesn't pertain to shipping, but I somebody listening that's either at a school or in industry or a vendor might hear this and maybe replicate this, but it's something I was really proud of. So I was teaching at Mississippi State, and I was teaching a crop of broadcast meteorologists. And as I said, we were going through this big transition into digital. I negotiated with one of the top 3 graphics companies that produce the visuals for television, which is a really important tool set for broadcast meteorologists. And this one at the time was probably maybe tied for number 2 or number 3 in the industry, but they were trying to grow. We negotiated a really nice deal to bring all of their tools in to be used for all of our students. And our students became champions of that system because they used it for 2 years nonstop while they were in school. It's been really neat to watch that company grow to be probably tied for number 1 in usage in the industry now. And I believe it's because we started this college program where they were using the software with the up and coming students, and they expanded it to other universities as well. And so they have a lot of just fans of their products and knowledge base that was developed at the school level. And now it's being used by television stations all over the place. We were a huge feedback center. A normal TV station might have 4 meteorologists on staff using software, and it's being used live. We were a university that had 25 or 30 students using it around the clock. And so we could provide feedback that made it better. There's so many hidden benefits to having software as part of curriculum. And I would encourage, whether it's the companies that are utilizing the software, whether it's the software vendors themselves, maybe even alumni of programs, I would get those groups together and encourage that placement of new technology in student curriculum, really in any industry, but I could see shipping being a huge one, as we're talking about trying to not be the last dinosaur and really trying to advance that forward. That's a way that you get adaption and adoption, and you build a sort of a network of loyalty even towards these programs. So I think that's a big deal. DTN, if we had a program come to us and say, could we use one of your data APIs to help train the next group, I'd be all for that, because I just think that would be a really strong way. It's a good teaching tool, but it has benefits commercially too down the road.
That's definitely something that I hope that the schools are listening, or training programs are listening. But we're getting near our end time. And my last question, I love to ask people, I had a couple of journalists on, so I asked them the opposite question. I asked them what are they writing, but I'll go back to you unless you're writing something you want to share. But what are you reading? What's interesting to you these days?
So a good question. Well, I have a 3-year-old, and so most of the books that I get to see today have a lot of pictures and few words in them. But I found myself actually over the past 5 years really switching from reading into podcasts. I love listening to podcasts, and I find that podcasts that interest me are interview podcasts, almost biographical, where even celebrities, but I tend to favor sports, or just like really listening to really smart people on their background and what makes them tick, what got them there. I find that podcasts gets them out of the quick 10-minute late night TV show interview style and into here's what really makes me go. So the one that I've just started listening to in the last month was called Fly on the Wall, and it's run by David Spade and Dana Carvey, and they interview former cast members and hosts of Saturday Night Live. And it has been so cool to go listen to these stories from the 90s and 80s, how they got their start, because for many people, Saturday Night Live was their big break into show business and how they ended up getting there. I love the pre-story before they got there, because all of us start in a spot that nobody knows our name. Very few of us are gifted into our careers. I love the journey of, I just got my break and here's how I'm going to take off with it. And I think all of us can kind of benefit. So that's where I kind of get my entertainment and learning, is listening to successful people. And maybe one day I can become one of them. But I just love listening to those origin stories of successful people.
But Michael Lewis, who wrote Moneyball, he's in his third season of podcast, and it kind of touches on a couple of things. He talks this current season, well, season 3, I started with 3 because somebody recommended, talks about experts, and they're talking about like these really micro experts, how they just know whatever that they're doing. And it goes back to the farmer and the sailor and the experts, and you can't replace them. And there was one about a woman who was the medical billing expert, and they basically built a company that they sold into the market as an IPO, billions of dollars valuation on medical billing. So maybe at some point, maybe we'll be reading about you, Renny, and maybe this is just the start of your journey. And I hope that the Last Dinosaur gets up there, because that's what I try to make this podcast. But we appreciate your time and really some great insights. And I love the parallel of sailors and farmers. Really awesome stuff. Thank you very much for coming on the pod. I look forward to seeing you around and seeing more of what your company's going to be doing in the future.
Chris, thank you so much. This has been an honor and a pleasure. And it's fun to, as a kid that grew up in cornfields, like, a long way away from sea, it's been such an honor to get to work with shipping companies. From my perspective, teach them a little bit about weather and how we can leverage that to make their lives easier. But at the same time, to respect the history of shipping and to watch this transformation. We're just getting started, and there's so many amazing things ahead for us.
Thanks again, Renny. I appreciate it.
Yep. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this episode of The Last Dinosaur. You can find out more about Renny and DTN in the show notes. Of course, this podcast can be found in all the places you normally get your podcasts, such as iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and we have a YouTube channel. I'm your host once again, Chris Aversano. This is The Last Dinosaur, and I wish you fair winds and following seas.